What is going on, everyone? Nathan coming at you with a bit of a fun idea here. We've all been comparing the effect that Landorus and Great Tusk have on a metagame. They seem to be these similar bulky hazard setting, hazard removing. They're like the very samey type of Pokemon that see enormous usage and overused, right? And people being quick to make jokes about how there's, this is just Landorus in disguise Great Tusk and yada yada. But don't worry, once Landorus comes back, Great Tusk is going to be revealed for the sham they are. I even put out a video, or no, I'm about to put out a video probably shortly after this one comes out, talking about complain all you want. There will always be a top tier ground type and overused. That'll come out soon. And I even put out a tweet, to this effect too, talking about, you guys can't hear without the audio here, and I don't want to share the audio for copyright reasons. But same thing, this is just a common theme in Pokemon nowadays, right? And I thought this would be a fun idea is if we instead do an actual comparison of these two and talk about what their strengths are, what their weaknesses. We're all just kind of assuming do that flying typing and intimidate that Landorus is the better Pokemon of the two. But in this presentation, we're going to be talking about, is that true? What strengths does Great Tusk brings to the table? We'll be talking about once we have a metagame where Landorus does return, what does that look like? What are their niches going to be? This is just off some generic presentation software, and the first slide on this template was literally competitive analysis. I was like, it's perfect. It's absolutely, that's what's going on here. I used to do TED Talks all the time on this channel where I would dress up in a suit and treat it like a TED Talk. We're not doing that today. I'm not putting that much effort in, but I did work on this slide for a little bit this afternoon, and I'm hoping you guys enjoy the ultimate ground robin that nobody asked for, a pun that nobody asked for as well. Okay, so let's hop into it here. And the first thing that the two both have in common is, of course, going to be that ground typing, right? When you think of it, yes, it's nice to have an immunity to electric moves, but something I think of all the time is when you have a tank that has access to power, like it's still threatening, right? It still have access to powerful threatening moves. That means you're not just a wall that people set up on, like a cloister or not a cloister, like a fortress or something, right? Or even, I think Ferrothorn sometimes runs into this problem. Yes, it has a very powerful power whip, but Ferrothorn's base attacking stats are pretty mediocre. It gets around that a little bit because Leech Seed is always threatening. It's always gonna be like, recovering and all of that it does. But what makes Earthquake so amazing on Great Tusk and Landorus is even with zero investment, these Pokemon have such monstrous attack stats. You're always gonna be doing ridiculous damage out the gates. And that's also a similar thing with what made Scald so good on a Vaporeon or on a Toxapex or whatever. So if you have a tank who is threatening, like even a Brave Bird on a Corviknight with that decent attack stat can be very threatening. And that's a huge reason what makes these guys so good is even zero investment, you cannot ignore the damage that their Earthquake does. But beyond that, I think probably the bigger factor is how they're versatile tanks with extremely high physical defenses. With Intimidate, Landorus hits the same status as Great Tusk, but essentially just if you send these two in with defensive investment, you can just set it and forget it for 4 turns unless it's super effective. It's super effective. They can live 2 of almost anything, which is crazy to begin with. Like a Meowscarada Flower Trick is still only 2 at KOing this guy. But more importantly, if it's just against like an Earthquake, like against a Ting Lu, you're good. You can chill there all day. You can do whatever you need to do. You can bulk up, you can rapid spin, you can set hazards, which is a big part in these Pokemon, right? Is so much of what makes them good isn't just this strong Earthquake, but it's also just the utility they provide. And being able to do that completely willy-nilly against most physical attackers is really advantageous. I touched on it before, but hazard setting, hazard removal is huge. These are games of Pokemon, and oftentimes you're trying to fit somebody on your team. You think, on the 3rd or 4th slot, damn it, I really need somebody to set hazards and later on somebody to remove them. These Pokemon do both really easily. You're not sacrificing anything by doing that. They just come in, they set hazards. If they get a chance, they can remove them too, and then they get out of here, which is great. And of course, the biggest commonality that kind of is the inspiration of this whole video is the idea that they both have very high usage stats, right? But beyond that, let's actually compare about what makes the strengths of them unique one-on-one here, okay? So Landorus has a lot in its favor. And the first thing is, this is a big reason why I wanted to do this, is I wasn't sure how it would compare stats-wise between the two. I knew they were very close, but Landorus does, of course, have higher attack, one of the highest base stats in Pokemon, 145, which is Great Tusk, 131 base attack. A much higher special defense, like to the tune of about 30 points difference, which is significant. Landorus is a fantastic Assault Vest user. We know Great Tusk is a good Assault Vest user, of course, but Landorus is almost better because it has a +1 to physical defense with Intimidate and a +1 to special defense with that Assault Vest. So just come in and wreak havoc and come out. The difference being, I think Great Tusk is actually still a little bit better because it can do one of its major roles, which is hazard removal with Rapid Spin, counting as an attack, which you can't defog with Landorus when you have a Assault Vest equipped. So, kind of a plus and minus thing there. Slightly higher speed. I don't think it really matters much. It depends on the metagame. If there's a lot of base 90s hanging around, the difference between 87 and 91 on Landorus might really matter. Is it 91 or is it? Okay, I thought it was 92 for a second. No, we're good. And this is it. And again, huge reason why I wanted to do this, but functionally better physical defense. Depends on the investment. As this GIF actually really well illustrates, the base defense on Landorus is not normally fully invested like it is with the Great Tusk defensive sets. But it is worth noting that even with this set, it's got about like 7%, I think, better defenses than Great Tusk. And if you're fully invested, it's something more like to the tune of 20% or something like that, maybe 15. I don't know the exact math, but point is they're very similar with physical defense, but Landorus is a little bit better. In talking about that, it is a pivot with Intimidate too, which means it can come in, establish that defense lower, and then go to somebody else. So it's almost like you're setting up and helping somebody with like a baton pass or something. So I can go to Landorus, I can intimidate something, and then I can go to a frailer setup sweeper and get away with that. Whereas Great Tusk is kind of just there, Speaking of that sort of pivoting quality, it is a much better pivot thanks to U-turn. This makes it an excellent Scarfer. These two are very tied. Scarf on Great Tusk is fine, but you can't force swaps and then U-turn out like Landorus can. Landorus can come in on a heat ran, force the threat of an earthquake, and then U-turn on whoever they go to. So they go to Corviknight, you U-turn out, and then you get your big wall breaker Keldeo, and they're like, crap, that just let that happen to me completely for free. And we're gonna get into the typing as well, the difference between, so we're gonna get into like Intimidate versus Photosynthesis, and we're also gonna get into the flying typing versus the dark typing, or the fighting typing, excuse me. But for what it's worth, it is immune to spikes and webs, which Great Tusk is not. And again, if we're talking about that pivot quality, then being able to come in and shrug off a layer of 3 spikes is pretty handy. So generally what we're hearing here is better stats overall and a much better pivot, which is what they're both kind of known for. So kind of a damning start for them. Let's go to Great Tusk next here. And generally, I would say Great Tusk is better offensively. Some might kind of balk at that because, again, Landorus is known as a much better Scarfer. It has higher attacking stats than Great Tusk, but Great Tusk is a much better abuser of bulk up. Why is that? Because A, it can also boost its speed thanks to Rapid Spin, but B, more importantly, I talked about that idea of Intimidate. You may think, okay, Intimidate is actually better. Like let's pretend for a second here, it's not the case. Let's pretend that they functionally have the exact same physical defense, Landorus and Great Tusk, right? Once Intimidate gets factored in, let's just assume that. Which would you prefer in your opinion? Some would say they prefer Intimidate because, again, you can come in, you can lower the defense, and you can swap back out, which makes it, again, hold that whole pivoting quality. It can support your weaker Pokemon. It can help disincentivize your opponent from setting up. Whereas Great Tusk, I just got these stats. And in the case of this, where you're trying to stay in and you're trying to set up, that's actually a little bit better. Because if Landorus comes in and starts bulking up, your opponent can swap back out and go to like a Rillaboom or something, right? And be like, okay, bet, like now this guy's not intimidated and you're essentially -1 defense now. Whereas that's not the case for Great Tusk. You can swap around all you want. I still have this monstrous 131 base defense. Doesn't matter what you do to me, that you can't take that away from me, unlike Landorus' Intimidate. So that does matter, and that means once it's staying in for the long term, it's a slightly better sweeper. Kind of opposite again. If we're talking about how Landorus is a better pivot, if you're staying in for multiple turns, I think you generally prefer Great Tusk. It's in a similar vein. It's got a much stronger offensive move pool. We don't know if Landorus is going to keep knockoff in the new thing, so I don't want to get into move pool too much. When Pokemon Home comes, which should be soon, it sounds like, I really don't know who's going to be running what, so I don't want to get into too much. But again, Rapid Spin, fantastic. You have Headlong Rush instead of Earthquake if you're going purely offensive. You have Close Combat, whereas Landorus has almost no flying type moves, right? So it almost can't even use its second stab offensively. It also has access to Ice Spinner. So, frankly, if we're talking about the two of them in a 1v1 matchup, almost all times Great Tusk is going to win the 1v1. It has Body Press on a defensive set, which takes advantage of its defensive investment instead, which Landorus can't do. And I have it open right in front of me, and I think I'm missing one more. It's got Play Rough, it's got Rock Tomb, it's got Stone Edge, same as Landorus does. Does have Thunder Fang and Zen Headbutt. Yeah, it's pretty much all we need. Smart Strike, I didn't know that one. Anyways, it doesn't matter too much, but I think we can all agree it's got a generally much better offensive move pool, with the exception of U-turn. And then importantly, its offenses are such that with a stab close combat, it can 2-hit KO almost all of its counters. So no matter what you invest into a Corviknight, it can always be 2-hit KO'd by a choice banded Great Tusk. And there isn't an OU right now, anybody that can completely answer it. Amoonguss, which is probably the best answer you can think of, gets 2-hit KO'd by Ice Spinner. Azumarill gets 2-hit KO'd by Headlong Rush. I never remember the name of that one. Dragonite, once again, Ice Spinner. Gholdengo, even if it happens to have an air balloon, which would seem to be the perfect counter for it, guess what? Knockoff is still a 2-hit KO. I can go through the whole list here. There really isn't a counter. The best thing you can do is send in something like a Toxapex, who you force them. We're talking about a choice band hypothetical here. You send in a Toxapex, your opponent goes, okay, great, I'll click Headlong Rush, and then you terrestrialize Grass, and then you resist that instead, or Flying, whatever. That is theoretically the best way to answer in that case, but I just kind of think that this Pokemon is underrated as far as a wall breaker. I did a video 2 years ago in Sword and Shield about the best wall breakers, and it's kind of like Magnezone in the fact that if you guess correctly, there isn't really a Pokemon that can answer this Pokemon 2 hits in a row. So yes, better offensively, all that adds up to it is a better offensive Pokemon. It's a better offensive threat than Landorus for the most part. Landorus is super threatening. It does its job, but you know, the caveat to being a better pivot, in my opinion, is it doesn't do the things that Great Tusk excels at quite as well. Rapid Spin versus Defog. I don't think it's a very contentious opinion to say that Rapid Spin is better than Defog. It does damage. You can do things like break sashes or break multiscale. It boosts up your speed as well. Probably most crucially is that, especially in a metagame like this where hazard stacking is so important, you don't remove your own hazards. Yes, it loses to Ghost type, but I don't think there's a single Ghost type out there that super easily beats Great Tusk in a 1v1. Yes, there's situations where you go, okay, I know my opponent Great Tusk is going to Rapid Spin. I'm going to go to my Gengar, block the Rapid Spin, and then force it out with a Choice Specs 1-hit KO Shadow Ball. Sure, more credit to you, but if you're sending that in willy-nilly against a ground type Great Tusk, like, that's a scary thought. Like, you can't just do that easily, right? So I get it. Rapid Defog is, like, you know, 99 times out of 100 a better option, that it just, in the sense that it is always guaranteed to get off the hazards. If you don't care about hazards for your own team as much, you just set it and forget it and you go, whatever, I'm guaranteed removing these hazards with Defog. Whereas Rapid Spin, there's an element of indecision, but theoretically is what we're talking about here. Rapid Spin is better, like, all in all. And I think, and yeah, there's a whole Gholdengo of it, which we'll get into later, but if you're trying to keep hazards to your team, it kind of relates to that a little bit more. But we'll talk about Gholdengo a little bit more too. We talked about spikes before with Landorus, immune to spike and webs. I do think it's worth crediting that being 4 times resistance to Stealth Rocks is kind of amazing, right? It's the much more common hazard. Less so in Scarlet and Violet, but generally across Pokemon, it is by far and away the most common hazard, and you kind of just shrug it off for nothing. Like, it's less than Leftovers recovery damage, whereas Landorus is taking a not insubstantial 12% per turn, per swap in rather. And then there's the photosynthesis of it all, right? And I'm going to actually go ahead a slide for this because I think it's easy in an exercise like this to kind of, I'm skipping ahead here, to double count Intimidate on Landorus, right? Where you go, okay, you stack up all of what makes Landorus good in one column, and you stack up all of what makes Great Tusk good in another column, and you can easily double count Intimidate because you go, okay, he's got better physical defenses, and he's got a better ability to Intimidate. That's the same thing, essentially, that you're just counting twice. Whereas just at base, without any need of that ability, Great Tusk is very close to as bulky as Landorus. And then more importantly, it's got this other, yes, in a vacuum, worse ability than Landorus, but it's a +1 that it has to its kit that Landorus does not in that sense, right? So I hope I'm communicating that well, but I think the double counting in this aspect when you're comparing the two can definitely sway things in your favor. But still, let's get into like the abilities here. No question Intimidate's the better one than Photosynthesis, but again, once you consider that, you know, Great Tusk doesn't need Intimidate to be as bulky as Landorus, it kind of makes you go, sheesh. Like, the fact that there's even any conversation between the two is a little bit, like, impressive. So Intimidate, I don't know what more I have to say, lowers the opponent's attack by 1 stage when you swap in. It's great when you're swapping in, as I covered before with the whole bulk up discussion. It's worse against opponents who are swapping out because they can just do that, and then, you know, it's only as good as long as your opponent stays in. It adds utility to sacks. It's a really important usefulness to it. So let's say I've got a Great Tusk at 12% and a Landorus at 12%. The Great Tusk at 12% is kind of meaningless to me. I don't really care. It's not going to survive any hits. It's just a piece to use whenever a chance. Whereas Intimidate is kind of amazing. I can come in on a Pokemon, like let's say I'm looking at my opponent's physical Iron Valiant and I go, crap, that guy's going to completely 6-0 me. My Landorus' job was to answer it, but now my Landorus is at 12%. I screwed up. What am I going to do to answer this Pokemon? Well, you can send it in on a knockoff. It lowers the Iron Valiant's attacking stat, and now you can finally survive that hit with your it's a choice banded Valiant. Maybe you're Corviknight and the Corviknight can revenge kill. You get the idea, right? So it is very useful in sacks. And once again, I did talk about that double counting of it there. Photosynthesis, it gives versatility. So if you use booster energy, for example, it just means that you can have a defensive Great Tusk that can still be offensive like a choice band variant, but still accomplish the same things that a defensive Great Tusk would do. So it can still be an answer to Gholdengo. It can still rapid spin and set hazards and stuff like that. But the second you send it in first being the caveat and the key part in all this, it can still, force a 2-hit KO on a Corviknight with a close combat, right? That's pretty crazy. So with booster energy, I should have written that here on this first bullet point here. It can actually answer, it can do both of its niches in a really good way. Because that's, I haven't even talked about this quite yet, but I think that's the more interesting thing about Great Tusk is Landorus does have different variants of it, where there's more offensive Landorus is, there's more defensive ones. But for the most part, a Landorus is kind of a Landorus, and you can answer it the same way, right? Like you send in a Corviknight, you send in a Tornadus, like it's very easy at team preview to know exactly what you're getting against a Landorus for the most part, right? Whereas a Great Tusk, it can be kind of anything, right? It can come in and be photosynthesis, bulk up. It can be just a choice bander that destroys you right away, and without that booster energy to kind of tell what their set is, you don't know if it's just going to set up rocks or if it's just going to try to 2-hit KO you straight away. It can be, as we just talked about, a very good defensive pivot who just comes in, removes hazards, and sets their own. It can do all of that, and that's kind of what I wanted to highlight there with the booster energy, is you can kind of do a bit of both in that sense with that item. But regardless of your set is, even if you're choice band, even if you're booster energy, even if you're leftovers, all of them are still good versus Sun teams. You don't have to be planning for Sun whatsoever. And if your opponent sends in, a special attack boosted, that's actually a bad example. If they send in, I don't know, whatever, some sort of photosynthesis, whatever, some sort of Sun Sweeper, doesn't matter. You can, reap the benefits of your photosynthesis is normally a higher defense Great Tusk. It's not nothing. It's not gonna happen a ton. Depends, at the beginning of the Walking Wake meta, that's something that came up like pretty frequently, like 1 in 4 games, where you're like, okay, well, for half of this game, my Great Tusk essentially has a +1 to defense. That's not nothing, And the third one, again, not terribly common, but you can throw it onto your own Sun teams if you have one. That's something that you can't say for Landorus. It doesn't really have any synergy with, it's just, it fits in everything. There's no specific synergy going for it. Whereas Choice Band Photosynthesis Great Tusk is a freaking threat, man. Like that's not something you can shrug off. And unlike a lot of Sun teams that are kind of special, Weather Ball and Flamethrower and stuff like that, even Walking Away kind of fits that mold of like a special sweeper with different options going for it. This thing is just like a freaking battering ram. It just comes at you with this ridiculously high base attack, functional speed, and it just breaks whatever you've got and you hope you swap right. So the third one seems like kind of like whatever, dude. What are we talking about, the grand scheme of things? But realistically, like the fact that it does have that versatility on a Sun team, I think is a feather in its cap. But again, no one's saying Photosynthesis is better than Intimidate, but when you consider that it's got the same base defenses without Intimidate as Landorus kind of does with physical defense, of course. Plus it's got all this kind of just like nice little, oh, that's nice. Oh, that's nice. Oh, that's nice. That Great Tusk has with Photosynthesis. It's just kind of, it's nice. To overuse that one term. And now let's get into the flying versus fighting thing here. I don't think it's hilarious. If you had asked me last generation, what is a better typing to have on your defensive pivot, I would have laughed in your face. And maybe you guys are laughing in my face right now too. That's fair. Like more credit to you. But I do think it's at least worth mentioning in the current metagame. Whoops, and then I lost it. So flying, of course, ground immunity, grass fighting resist. It pairs so well with the ground typing because that electric immunity is just marries perfectly. It makes grass neutral to you. It means the weakness to rock types that flyings normally have is neutralized to the ground too. The only caveat is that you have an ice 4 times weakness. But my opinion is kind of like, if we're talking about Great Tusk here, Great Tusk is never staying on an ice beam or an ice shard anyways, right? It's a weakness is still a weakness. I feel like 4 times weaknesses are always exaggerated. Like you never want to be staying in on that anyways. Heat Rain's not staying in a fighting type move any more frequently than a Tyranitar is for the most part, right? Even though it's a 2 times versus a 4 times weakness, right? So I don't think it's really questioned that ground flying was one of the best universal typings ever. Yes, but it's worth mentioning that in the current metagame, there's not a lot of earthquake threats around right now. I've got it right in front of me right now. We've got Clodsire to worry about, whatever. Garchomp is kind of barely making OU at this point. Super threatening for sure. Great Tusk, it's itself there, so it's kind of hard to judge like whether it'd be better for it to be a flying typing there. But even then, often not offensively invested. Iron Treads, barely in the tier at this point, almost more UU than OU. And then Ting Lu, who almost runs Ruination more than Earthquake at this point, but again, more of a wall than anything else. There's not these big threatening ground types like there used to be in Gen 5, you know? In Gen 5, having Landorus' flying typing was essential because it gives you answers against, well, Dugtrio, but also Mamoswine, and Garchomp was more heavily used. Landorus in that case, which is kind of double counting there. Guess that's it. Donphan was OU in Gen 5. That's funny. It's kind of like a weird parallel here talking about. I don't know. Point is, I think you can make the argument that a ground immunity is less important than it has been in a long time in overuse. That's the general gist of what I'm saying here. And if we're talking about the current overused, a dark resist is kind of insane. So the dark type Pokemon you have to worry about in this generation that Landorus would struggle with, and Great Tusk does not at all. Ting Lu again comes up. Roaring Moon, huge. The threat of Crunch is massive, and you can completely shrug it off. And you know, if you keep in mind with the Dragon typing, is you're kind of forced to use a bad offensive move like Outrage or Dragon Claw, whereas Crunch is a much better mid ground, honestly. You know, Scarada, super threatening with its knockoff. King Ambit, super threatening. Hydreigon, of course. It is special, so it doesn't quite fit as well. Point is, there's a lot more dark threats than they're having at different points in the metagame. Terra Dark Iron Valiant is pretty common, right? So I put out a tweet earlier in the generation where I was like, what kind of world are we living in that firefighting is one of the best defensive typings in Pokemon, referring to Paldean Fire Tauros. And that's what I'm thinking. Like, I fighting type used to be a joke as a defensive typing. Nowadays, it's just, I think it's legit, like, decent. The biggest caveat would be it's got weaknesses to pretty prominent typings in Psychic, Fairy, and Flying, which once again, from previous generations, that's kind of damning. Think about all the Tapus from last generation. Think about OU staples like Alakazam, or even we saw a lot of Indeedee usage last generation. And then Flying types are also one of the more common Pokemon in the tier, especially with Pokemon that are common like Tornadus. Corviknight is still running around. Pelipper is still running around a little bit. Zapdos, though, is going to be returning shortly. Flying type weaknesses also important. It's worth noting. But in the current generation, we don't got to worry about that at all, really. You have Corviknight, yes, that's a common matchup. Dragonite, sure, but that's often not running any flying coverage. And then that's it in OU as far as I know. I've got it in front of me right here, and I can't see anything else. So that's where that third point comes in, where these weaknesses, I don't really care that much, and I don't care about that ground immunity so much. I'd almost prefer the dark type weakness. So kind of a belabored point there you guys get, but it's not as cut and dry as it used to be, and maybe will be. It's worth noting. Now we got to talk about the Gholdengo of it all. Gholdengo is the most warping Pokemon. Don't let the usage stats like throw you off. Yes, it has much lower usage than it used to. Yes, it's got much lower usage than Great Tusk probably will ever have, but it's the most metagame warping Pokemon in the game. If for some reason you don't know what it does, it is unique in that its ghost typing blocks rapid spins, great, but its ability also blocks defogs. So essentially, once you set up hazards, you can deny all attempts to remove hazards from your opponent by using Gholdengo here. Most Pokemon that would rapid spin or defog have a poor matchup with it 1v1, and it can kind of stay in indefinitely against your Corviknights, your who else is a rapid spinner off the top of my head? I'm struggling right now. Against your Quackleval, whatever, it doesn't matter too much, right? Normally you could stay in against them pretty, where do I want to put myself there? Fine, that's fine. Normally you could stay in against them fine. Great Tusk is an exception. It can't, Gholdengo cannot easily swap in on a Great Tusk. It gets O-Code or 2-Hit KO'd by Earthquake. That's why you see the air balloons, even in this little fan art here. But Knockoff is also super threatening too. It can easily 2-Hit KO. So the fact that the big reason why Tusk sees so much usage is because it is the solver to this problem that is presented by Gholdengo, in that it warps the metagame and it forces hazards to be unremovable. So it's always going to be linked to the two. I actually talked about this a lot, but also the nature of it is it's kind of linked to Gholdengo more than you would think, in that rapid spin works better when you have a Gholdengo on your own. And what that means is, imagine hypothetically, I'm in an OU game, I set a million hazards, and I go, ah-ha-ha, my opponent can no longer remove them because I have Gholdengo. Great, right? But if your opponent sets hazards and you need to get rid of those, Defog just ruins all your work, whereas Rapid Spin, once again, only affects your side. So it's actually got a better synergy, not just against Gholdengo, but with it, because again, it's all leading to that idea of keeping the hazards on your opponent's side no matter what. And we did talk about this third bullet point a little bit here. So I do think that if we're talking about Great Tusk and why it's thriving in the current metagame, I think we can agree, even at this point in the presentation, that it is worse than Landorus. But it's worth noting that it's so specifically built for this metagame. It doesn't have to deal with these threats like it would in other metagames, Psychic, Flying Fairy. It does have an answer for all these dark types that are running around right now. It is a unique answer to Gholdengo. However, if we're talking about, comparing the two, if Landorus was in Great Tusk's shoes, I think it would also be a really good answer for Gholdengo. Earthquake will be doing even more damage to it than Great Tusk would. Classically, Landorus also has access to knockoff, but also more importantly, if we're talking about the indecision of what move to click against a Gholdengo coming in on you with Air Balloon, you can actually U-turn on a Gholdengo swap in, which A, lets you go to like your Dragapult to force it out or something like that, but B, it removes the balloons so that next time it comes in, it's threatened by a Earthquake. So I don't really worry about Dragonite. I think Landorus would be just as good, if not a better, answer to Gholdengo in this meta game than Great Tusk is. And in talking about other things in this meta game, I don't know why I kind of put this early. We're going to talk about this in a later slide. I think it's Intimidate would also mean it suits up. It matches up well versus the rest of the OU tier right now. And that's, I kind of that early there, but let's get into it. What is Lando's role going to be in Scarlet and Violet? Well, it's immediately going to be the best offensive pivot in the metagame, which sounds pretty superlative, but there's actually not a lot of great offensive pivots right now. Normally that was Cinderace's greatest role, but Cinderace does have much more reduced role nowadays. Corviknight's more of a defensive pivot, and Corviknight's not as good as it used to be, in part because Landorus is gone. I have that as that fourth point there. Corviknight is fine. Right now it's quite good, but it's not as good as it used to be because Landorus here isn't around to be its perfect kind of counter. It also will do the same for Weavile. Probably other ice types are going to make this Pokemon, counters this Pokemon, unfortunately, or rise as it does. So this is something I talked about here, which is the idea of it's going to be more important than ever in a sense, because if we talk about Sword and Shield OU, X and Y OU, Black and White OU, it's always just being a good Pokemon. That's just a glue Pokemon. It fits into your team nicely, and you're always glad to have it. And you can always find some sort of role for it. Either it's a Scarfer, or sometimes it's a Shadow Sweeper. Most frequently, of course, it's an offensive pivot. You can always find room for it. But in this metagame, it'll be the first time where you kind of need it, right? You're like, shit, like I don't have a Gholdengo counter on my team. I'm going to get rinsed by hazards if I don't include some sort of Gholdengo counter. So it's the first time where that's ever existed. But also by the same I don't know what the word is, by the same token, it's less important than ever because it has a Pokemon that fills a very similar niche to it for the first time ever. There's been other like pivots that are, kind of similar to Landorus, like I guess Tornadus last generation is kind of a similar-ish role, but Tusk, as this whole video is suggesting, is a very close, counterpart to Landorus. It does some things a little bit better, does a lot of things a little bit worse, but they're very similar, right? So because of that, it might see less usage because there's going to be usage split between the two, right? They fill a similar role. It's going to be pretty uncommon, you both on your team. So enforcing a choice, it's possible that Landorus just dominates and it sees like, this niche we're talking about of being a defensive ground type that answers Gholdengo. It's possible Landorus like dominates that role and sees 90% of the usage there, but I would predict it's something more akin to like, a 70-30 or a 60-40 split. The comparison I think of is Skarmory and Corviknight in last generation, where similar Pokemon, similar roles, except Corviknight had the niche of being able to U-turn out. It also, similar to Great Tusk, it had setup potential with bulk up, iron defense, power trip, shit like that. So Corviknight had that kind of niche going for it, whereas Skarmory was the opposite. And it couldn't pivot, sure, but it could set up hazards, and it was a bit more of like a stally presence on your team, right? So that's how I predict things will kind of shake out for Landorus and Great Tusk here. And in talking about Great Tusk going forward, it will be a 1B to Landorus's 1A. So I don't think it's going to be invalidated, but it is going to no longer be the top dog at what it does. What makes it so like essential and quintessential right now is this idea of if you fill this role, it's got to be Great Tusk, right? But now there's going to be probably a better Pokemon doing that than Great Tusk. As such, I think I'll have more freedom to run offensive sets. If I'm going to be going forward, you know, if I'm about a year from now when Pokemon Home is released and I see a Great Tusk on the enemy team, I'm probably like radar, you know, alarms are dinging going, uh-oh, this guy could be offensive and could be going for some sort of like, you know, choice band close combat, which could 2-hit KO my whole team. I got to keep an eye out on that. And that's going to be more present than ever right now. Because if I see Great Tusk right now, there's a chance it's offensive, but I'm not really taking it that seriously because it's realistically about 20% of the time where you see that, right? Whereas now if it's 50-50, I'm in a really tough spot. I go, okay, shit, I can either go to my Corviknight and try to defog these rocks that this guy's about to set up, or I'm supposed to, you know, go to a Tornadus or whatever and have some sort of answer for this close combat that's coming my way, right? You're not gonna be able to choose very easily. And yeah, maybe it'll gain respect as the amazing wall breaker it is that I think is kind of slept on right now. And then it becomes more of a staple of hazard control. It might be actually more stall based, despite what I just said about being offensive, it might become a bigger staple of stall than you see otherwise because it's got a better synergy with Gholdengo than Landorus does. Like I just said, if you have to choose a hazard control pivot on your team to pair with Gholdengo and to ensure that hazards stay up on your opponent's side, not your own, it's got to be Great Tusk there because the rapid spin threat. So yeah, I think that's the sort of roles that I predict early on. I don't want to get into things too much. I hate predicting metagames because so many things can happen. And I've got a pretty poor track record of it, honestly. And to be honest, I don't even fully understand which Pokemon are incoming in the new metagame, but I do think it's, you know, I think what I just said is pretty apparent, unless something goes very, very wrong and there's some new threat that Great Tusk can beat that Landorus never will. But this is also like built into it from the presentation there. If you are frustrated with the Great Tusk usage, don't worry, we're almost at the finish line. And I think this is kind of signed for optimism, right? If we're talking about, you know, Tusk and Landorus being a 1A and 1B, we could be entering a metagame where we're no longer seeing one Mon dominate the usage ranks with 60% usage stats, right? Landorus or Tusk. Now there is going to be a bit of a role split down the middle, and both are going to have their own niches to make them better. So if you're worried about one Pokemon dominating the rankings, at least it'll be a little bit more variety to it in that sense, which is kind of fun for us. I do think, again, now that I've kind of thought of it for the first time, just talking earlier, but I think the Corviknight and Skarmory split last generation is a very apt comparison. Granted, some people might have a stronger reaction to that to me because, you know, Corviknight was thought to be much, much better than Skarmory last generation, which I always thought was silly. I feel like they were nearly identical Pokemon and the usage stats were completely skewed. I thought that was a little bit odd. I thought that Skarmory, you know, with its Stealth Rock and Spikes usage made it more condensed Pokemon. It made it work in a lot of different teams that weren't otherwise. I often frequently didn't run U-turn in the first place on Corviknight. You know, there's so many Defog, Roost, Brave Bird, Body Press Corviknights running around. I'm like, if at that point, like that's the same thing that Skarmory does, except Skarmory has a higher base defense, you know? Sure, it's less Spadef, but anyways, that's a sub rant right there. But I do think that's, you know, when I say Skarmory versus Corviknight, it suggests a very harsh split, but viability-wise, I think they were actually much closer than the stats would appear. And I'm thinking that's what we'll be seeing going forward once we have Landorus in the metagame and Great Tusk in the metagame. I actually can't believe I didn't show this guy the whole time, but this guy from the Pokemon.com too. So I am a fan. I am ready to see him soon. This little guy, ready to terrorize the metagame, are you? Oh yeah? Okay, great. So I hope you guys enjoyed. That was a longer presentation than I thought. It would be a little bit more effort than I expected, but definitely a fun video concept. Hope you guys enjoy. I'll catch you next time. Take it easy.